So I'm delighted to welcome Giuditta and David to present today. So they're here. They're both based at Birmingham University. David works on how individuals. Sorry, I've got to get my notes back up. Terrible memory. David focuses on how individuals form perceptions and relationships and how these shape diplomatic initiatives. And Giuditta focuses on international security with an interest in peace processes and war to peace transitions. But today they're here to talk to us about Lego, which I think is just about the most delightful topic we could have for a webinar. So I'm going to pass it over to them to get us started. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you everybody for obviously attending. I'll just bring the slides up now so can everybody see those hopefully. Yeah, so this is to provide sort of a very brief bit of context. This is sort of part of a project that Giuditta started and I came on board with this sort of time last year around using Lego in political science and international studies and sort of what we'll be sort of pointing towards. You can obviously pick up a little bit already from the title. So this is sort of what we're going to try and get through in terms of the time today. So trying to have as short a presentation as possible whilst giving you a flavour of what we've been up to and then leaving plenty of time for Q&A. Now, some of this might already seem or you might already be aware of some of these challenges yourselves or might be able to think of some others. But in terms of teaching in higher education, there's a number of different challenges. So timetabling, class sizes, class layout, depending on your institutional environment. A lot of these might be centralized. You might have no control over these dynamics. Obviously, class sizes can vary not just in terms of the number that are set at the beginning, but students dipping off as the term goes on for one reason or another. In terms of then the sort of groups that we have, obviously, learning styles, preferences can vary. People can prefer, traditional methods, lectures, being on the receiving end of content delivery versus those who prefer more interactive dynamics. Increasingly, obviously, with sort of the internationalization of recruitment within higher education, particularly at postgraduate level, but also at undergraduate level, right? People coming in who English is not their first language, and so potential language barriers. When thinking about politics and international relations, particularly in the context that we were working in, there can be a lot of sensitive content that related to conflict and war, which can be triggering for individuals, particularly if people have come from regions that have been directly affected, either historically or contemporarily, by conflict. And also the general dynamics of politics in IR courses, where there is sort of limited space for people to develop sort of classmate relationships or coursemate relationships in relation to, say, other programs where the teaching time is more intensive in terms of the day, and people spend most of their time together, moving from lectures into tutorials, etc. So that's sort of the broad context in which we were sort of operating and thinking about in terms of using Lego. Now, some of you are probably already familiar with active learning and active learning approaches. What we sort of pulled in for this project and something that we've picked up in sort of the literature is this emerging playful learning turn or approach, sort of building on and going beyond active learning. In higher education, this has kind of been connected to sort of the use of simulations and games. And other tools, which we'll talk about in a moment. But with playful learning as an approach, both students themselves and educators are largely unfamiliar with this particular approach to teaching, even though it is related to sort of active learning in some broad terms. And playful learning in some ways is also connected to some other terminology that is floating around in the ether. So ideas like serious play, simulation, role play, hard fun, and as I said, also this use of games and simulations. And as I sort of already pointed to, there is a connection with the sort of student-centered active learning approach, partly because of the focus of playful learning being about active engagement in student learning processes. Now, when we're thinking about sort of play and playfulness, obviously with anything, we need to be thinking about our terminology. And so here, playfulness is sort of pointing towards a state of mind or an attitude towards a context or an object where play is involved. And the emphasis here is on sort of open-ended experiential learning processes, and that are also effective, right? So when we're thinking about playfulness and play, this is sort of the angle that we're coming at. Now, within the sort of playful learning literature that we've sort of pulled in on for this project, one of the main metaphors is this idea of the magic circle. And basically it's the idea that in the classroom we can create a space that's sort of separate from the real world, is sort of socially constructed by those involved in the classroom, and within that space, we can develop alternative norms, codes of practice, rules of behaviour, which can enable play to take place and playfulness to exist in those spaces. Now, obviously, as with all sort of emerging sort of trends, there is some discussion about the value of playful learning as an approach. And some of the elements that have been picked up so far in the literature is that the playful learning approach can enable knowledge development through a couple of different ways, some of which are a bit counterintuitive to the trends that we see in higher education. So learning through failure, through the experience of attempting something and it not really working, making mistakes sort of fits into that space. Risk taking in terms of the activities and experiences, and then obviously experimentation again in terms of the activities and how we go about things in the classroom. And this obviously contrasts to a certain extent with the context in which we're all operating in, where value is related to outcomes, not necessarily the processes. And so playful learning is sort of challenges some of those ideas. And from the literature, we sort of pulled out, okay, there's a couple of ways that playful learning can be helpful in the classroom. So playful learning can sort of aid student motivation through sort of removing some of these barriers to learning, can aid understanding and knowledge retention, whilst also providing a way to balance sort of serious course content, which in our context, we're talking about war, conflicts, very serious, very heavy topic areas, which some students can find difficult, balancing that seriousness with also making content more approachable as well. Playful learning can also help with sort of the critical engagement and reflection because it involves this hands-on element, which we'll pick up again as a thread in a moment, and that it's quite useful for building relations between individuals, social bonding, developing that group cohesion in classrooms, and is pointed out to be particularly helpful for enabling learners to understand and value the views and perspectives as others in the classroom, which obviously is quite helpful. Within the literature, there's a couple of ways that people have talked about playful learning and how we can actually use it in the classroom. So there's three here. So the one that sort of most people might be more familiar with might be the idea of playful tools. So this is the idea of bringing in playful learning into the environment and developing sort of playfulness through the use of certain tools. So in our context, we were obviously using and talking about Lego, and Lego has been thought of as one of these sort of tools, but games and simulations that people might have already used themselves in the classroom would fit into this, idea of playful tools, techniques. So this is thinking about, ways to encourage play and playfulness. So this could be, things like trying to bring humor into teaching, or those sorts of aspects. And then tactics here relates to sort of adding into the existing teaching setting, aspects that aid sort of the playfulness aspects. So what we'll be talking about today fits very much in that first category of tools, but it's useful to just point out, okay, there are these other areas that people are trying to unpack in terms of playful learning. Now, in terms of Lego in higher education, there has been very limited, or at least we came across very limited engagement with Lego within political science and international studies. And where it has been used, it's mainly been as a material to be used. And where it has been used, which is often in sort of STEM subjects, the focus has been on, developing transferable skills or study skills, not necessarily about engaging with disciplinary content and debates. And so in this particular study by Liang et al., they talked about the way that Lego has been used, again, primarily within in STEM subjects in terms of, aid in sort of looking at theory, examining practice, reflection, which again, you might find the use of Lego in, say, library services picks up on this sort of reflection aspect quite a bit, and also in developing communication between groups. Excuse me. So like with playful learning, Lego can be used to sort of do a number of different things. So one aspect is enabling students to organize their thinking through the process of building models. So this idea of constructionism. So the very process of building the model helps people think and reflect on sort of what they're talking about. And this can be helpful for students who have got, these different learning preferences. Again, through this reflective element, it can encourage students to engage with sort of emotional meaning making, reflection, and also self-awareness. So tapping into that constructivism aspect. It can be quite inclusive as a learning approach, particularly when used in those reflective elements, because it allows the students to have an increased voice, but also that aspect of, sharing people's perspectives and actively listening to each other is often connected with the use of Lego here. And again, overlapping with this playful learning, there's the element of increased group coherence, bonding, particularly where there's diversity across ages and geographical backgrounds, experiences, and to a certain extent, the fact that Lego is quite popular within the culture. Generally, in popular culture, obviously means that for a lot of people, they've either had Lego as children, they have children of their own who engage with Lego or engage with Lego in some other way, shape, or form, or at least familiar with it if they don't engage with it directly. So I'll hand over to Giuditta at this point.
Thank you, David. So as David mentioned, we started off with an idea of what Lego might do for us in political science and international studies. And then we came up with several pilot activities that we tried out in our classroom. I will just give you a very quick snapshot of one of the activities with it, which is probably the simplest activity that we carried out, and it is called Building War. The idea was to come up with an activity that would allow us to engage with conceptual definitions and the unpacking of complex and emotionally challenging contexts and concepts within a master's course. So we tried out and developed this activity as part of a master's course called Contemporary Perspectives on Conflict, which over the past few years has enrolled between 35 and 60 students. And we have carried out this activity systematically over the past few years as part of the first lecture, so as a large group activity. And all in all, the activity generally takes about 30 minutes. So this really speaks to the scalable nature of using Lego in the classroom, to the fact that you can use it also in large groups and for fairly short periods of time, which is not the case for a lot of the playful learning activities that have to do with gaming, simulations, and that are better suited for smaller groups and for longer sessions. Now, the purpose of this particular activity was to engage students in debates over the nature of war and conflict over time and place, to elicit knowledge and experience that students might have already coming into the course, but might not realize that they have, so as to link the content of the course to their previous knowledge, previous experience, and make sure that students find that they themselves have something to contribute to the discussion and to the classroom. To build confidence among students, both for those who come from different contexts and for those who have never studied at the master's level before, which is the wide majority of our students. And then finally, to build a team, which is one of the goals of our activities, which hadn't been unpacked previously in Lego-based pedagogical literature, but we found that team building is actually quite a nice outcome of playful learning activities. David, would it be okay to go to the next slide? So what did we do? The activity, again, is called Build a War, and we asked students, what is a war? We gave to each of the student groups some bags of mixed Lego bricks, and then we provided slides or printed instructions. Again, we divided students into several groups of 5. The activity itself is possible also as an individual level activity, but as I mentioned, we were trying to also create groups and make people more comfortable with talking to each other and sharing their own experiences. So for us, it was really crucial to plan it and deliver it as a group activity. And then we provided the following instructions on a slide. We asked them to use the Lego pieces in the bag to build a model of a conflict or war. The object you build does not need to accurately represent a real conflict, but can be inspired by one. Can include most of the pieces in the bag, but doesn't necessarily need to include all of them, and should be explained to the rest of the class. And we gave them 10 minutes for this exercise. Next slide, please. So this is what the students came up with. These are models from their activities last year. And so you get an idea of what they could do in 10 minutes. Next slide, please. Following their build, we asked them to explain. Sorry, David, can you go back one slide, please? So we asked students to explain their models to each other. And while they were explaining, we wrote down keywords on the board to capture the different elements and the different keywords that they use to describe the concept of war and conflict across their models. And we generally came to identify a whole range of commonalities in what the students would mention when describing their models. They would mention concepts and keywords related to having several sides in a conflict. So the first model is a good example of where students identified two sides in a conflict. They might have keywords that had to do with organized violence or weapons. So the third model in this regard is quite illustrative because you can see these weapons and I think they are planes on the right. And they might also have keywords that have to do with destruction, loss of life, loss of property, which is quite well exemplified by the model in the middle, where you can see destruction. Next slide, please. So having outlined all these keywords on the board, we then projected a whole range of definitions of war and conflict that we drew from the literature. And the purpose of this exercise was to show to the students that the elements that they had themselves identified while building their wars through Lego were elements that emerged in the actual literature and that actually help us define the concept of war and conflict across place and time. So again, much like in the models, the theory emphasizes violence between different sides, the use of force, armed forces, so a sustained and organized violence leading to fatalities or the destruction of life and property, and underpinned by particular causes, what we call contested incompatibilities. So in showing the different definitions to students and linking them back to their models, we really managed to anchor what is often a boring and quite dry discussion around how different authors have defined a very complex concept into their models and their personal experiences. Next slide, please. We have used the same basic building blocks, same Lego building blocks for other activities. So two examples here on the slide is the activity building bridges, which we devised and implemented again as part of the MA in Contemporary Perspectives on Conflict, and which relies not only on an initial build, but also on a whole range of different contingency cards that we produced to get students to interact with their initial build and to appreciate the challenges to constructing and sustaining peace in conflict-affected settings. And the second activity is an activity that David has recently tried out in an undergraduate module, and it requires students to build a model of an environmental issue of their choice. It was a very short activity that was aiming to both get students to work together, but also for them to engage with particular issues that had to do with the environment. Next slide, please. Now, the question is, does it work? And we would say that certainly Lego works for the purposes that we intended it to work. We carried out a student survey last year, and all respondents reported that taking part in Lego-based activities was more enjoyable as compared to a traditional lecture. They also, the wide majority, reported that using Lego helped improve their understanding of concepts, which was our intent. 88% reported that it had helped them communicate with their classmates about challenging and difficult topics. And then based on their experience, they would recommend using Lego in the classroom. Next, David, please. When looking at their reflections, we were able to really unpack the reasons why Lego was helpful as a tool for playful learning in conflict and peace studies. So one of the students was saying that it was enjoyable when the group was communicating and it helped their brain rest. So in a way, it felt like a rest, while in fact, students were unpacking and building a representation of highly complex and contested concepts. Another student argued that it makes it easy to visualize the relationships, making it easier to understand some concepts that are usually abstract. This can also be done with case studies, but the problem with case studies is that they come with a lot of nuances, often emotional connections and personal connections to students, whereas the use of Lego really helps get to a more abstract level. And then using Lego helps to apply complex theoretical issues through a simple, accessible, and easy to understand activity while providing reflection. And this is a point that has to do with the activity on building bridges, where the student reflects that the Lego comes in different shapes and sizes, with some pieces being considered not as useful as others, which provides an interesting representation of how peace processes are often imperfect, owing to limited resources available. And then another student reflected that team building was a crucial component, and it was the ability to open up discussion. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, a lot of our reflections, as well as a description of the activity, is available in a journal paper that we have recently published with International Studies Perspectives, and you do have the link on this slide. All in all, we found that using Lego is a very useful complement to a lot of other playful learning tools that we might want to use in our classrooms. And it is useful because it leverages this constructionist and constructivist aspect of learning and helps us build teams around even challenging and complex topics in our classrooms. But I'm looking forward to your questions, so please do feel free to either ask us questions now or get in touch after reading the paper with any comments that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation.